Hi everyone, this is our last lecture of the semester. We are covering Chapter 16, Legal Controls and Freedom of Expression. We're going to be talking about freedom of speech as it relates to the media industry. First, we're going to start with a conversation on different models of expression. We often think about the press and freedom of speech from an American point of view. We're lucky that we live in a country that has a free press, but only 13% of the world's population is the same and lives in a country with a free media system. So there are a lot of different points of view on how the media should be allowed to operate. And there's a book called The Four Theories of the Press that offers four basic conventional models of how media and government interact with each other. And they begin with one extreme, the authoritarian model, which is basically the idea that people are elected into positions of power because they know what's best for the population. They're the elites, and they guide what the media tell the rest of the population, how issues are framed, the information, they dictate the information that gets put out. Then we have the communist or state model, which is where the government owns and controls the press. So all of the information sources are government owned, regulated, and created. The United States operates on what's called a social responsibility model, where you've heard this before, the press will function as a fourth estate or a fourth branch of government, which is basically the idea that our press are open and free to report on, critique, criticize, and basically hold responsible our government and elected officials. And then a more extreme version of the social responsibility model is the libertarian model, which means there are absolutely no restrictions on speech whatsoever. So most countries fall somewhere along this continuum between an authoritarian model and a libertarian model. Believe it or not, the freedom of the press was not actually written into the Constitution. It's something that came a little bit later. The Constitution was written in 1788, but the freedom of the press was added by the Bill of Rights in 1791. It was first challenged in 1798 by the Sedition Act. So President Adams signed the Sedition Act into law, and he did so because a lot of people in the media were criticizing the war with France, and he didn't want any public opinion or public support for the war to be swayed. So the Sedition Act basically said you're not allowed to criticize government officials. This act expired in 1801 under Thomas Jefferson's presidency. He opposed it initially, and when he took office after Adams, he just let the legislation expire. One important term when we think about discussing freedom of the press is prior restraint. So prior restraint, the concept of prior restraint is that government cannot block speech or publication before it occurs. And so this is the idea that if the government knows that a media organization has access to information that they don't want to be put out into the public point of view, they are not allowed to say you cannot print something. That's considered censorship as prior restraint. This was challenged in 1971 during the Vietnam War when something called the Pentagon Papers came into light. So this picture over here on the left is Daniel Ellsberg. He used to work for the Department of Defense, and he stole a publication that detailed a lot of the things that were going on in the Vietnam War that were considered top secret, and he leaked this to the Washington Post and the New York Times. And the Supreme Court, well, basically the government tried to prevent the New York Times from publishing the information in the Pentagon Papers. Obviously, the New York Times said that that violated their freedom of speech, The Supreme Court took up the case and ruled that the press must be left free to publish news, whatever the source, without censorship, injunctions, or prior restraint. So in 1971, the issue of prior restraint was upheld by the Supreme Court, allowing printed news to divulge information to the public regardless of where they got it. The issue of prior restraint was challenged again in 1979 when Progressive Magazine tried to publish an article that had detailed instructions on how to build a hydrogen bomb. Obviously, this was a national security issue. People at that time, particularly the information on how to build a hydrogen bomb, was considered classified and top secret, and it's an issue of national security if it got into the wrong hands, because other countries could create nuclear weapons and it could be very, very dangerous for the entire world. So Judge Robert Warren sided with the government on this one and said, yes, there's free speech, but nobody's going to have free speech if we're all dead because of a nuclear war. Other challenges to freedom of speech have popped up from time to time. One thing called seditious expression was established in 1999 when we had Schenck versus the United States. And this is most famously known as you aren't allowed to say things that can cause a clear and present danger. So the very cited example of that would be yelling fire in a crowded theater. It's dangerous because it can cause a panic and people could get hurt, and that means you can't say it. So that's seditious expression, which again was established in 1919. And we also have copyright infringement laws that curtail freedom of speech in a way that protects the rights of authors and producers or people who have created music or art, so that it can't be distributed or copied by anyone else other than the author. And eventually, copyright law will expire, and then that piece of art becomes public domain, and anyone in the public has free access to that song or that piece of art after public domain occurs. So that's why we can sing songs like Silent Night or Happy Birthday or all these really old famous songs, because public domain has already occurred and the copyright protection has expired for those pieces of art. Not all forms of speech are protected. As we know, there are some unprotected forms of expression. One of those is libel, and that is basically when you publish something in writing that isn't true about someone. Now, obviously, this really applies to private individuals. It's a lot harder to show a libel case or to win a libel case when we're talking about a public figure like a politician or a celebrity, because they live their lives in the public sphere. Slander is a form of libel that is spoken instead of written. And in order to win a libel or a slander case, somebody must prove actual malice, which is very hard to prove in the court of law. And this is the idea that the reporter or the editor knew the statement was false and printed or broadcasted it anyway with reckless regard for the truth. So you can see how proving actual malice could be difficult, because we don't know the intentions of people, of journalists, when they are producing and creating and releasing news. It's very hard to know if they intentionally knew that something was wrong and printed it anyway. Other unprotected forms of expression: obscenity and right to privacy. So obscenity laws were really established in 1973 under Miller versus California, and it basically said that in order for something to be considered obscene, it must meet these three criteria. One, the average person would find that the material as a whole appeals to a prurient interest, which basically means that the material lends itself to someone being sexually aroused by deviant behavior. 2, the material depicts or describes sexual contact in a patently offensive way. And 3, the material as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. So those are the 3 criteria for obscenity under Miller versus California. A lot of these have been relaxed or expired at this point. Obviously, people have a right to privacy, so there's a lot of personal information that people aren't allowed to publish. So a person has a right to be left alone without his or her name, image, or daily activities becoming public property. This was generally granted under the First Amendment, but when it comes to journalists, they have to respect a person's right to privacy if they are a private person. And even for celebrities, they're offered some protection to right to privacy, especially when they're on their own private property as well. Now we're going to shift to talking about censorship in media and how different media organizations or different media genres have grappled with government censorship. And the first form of censorship that really emerged was in film. Obviously, film, we know from our study of the history of media, was one of the first mass mediums in the United States. So it was obviously one of the first mediums that faced any type of censorship. And at the time, in the early 20th century, prominent members of society were really concerned about the impact of films on America's youth, and they feared that certain elements of film might degrade the morals of our society. And so they formed censorship groups, and many cities actually adopted film review boards, which basically allowed police to require permits or licenses to show a film in a specific city, and the film would have to be reviewed by this film review board and okayed by them before they were granted a license to show the film. And you can see here on the right, there's a picture of Jack Johnson, who was the very first black heavyweight champion. He won the heavyweight championship in 1908. After that, boxing films exploded and they were very, very popular. And basically they were censored almost everywhere in the United States under the guise of media violence, but really people were just very upset that he was black, and that was the reason for that censorship. As a result of some scandals, the movie industry decided to self-regulate, hoping that if they regulated themselves, 2 things would happen. Number 1, some of the audience that they lost because they were offended would come back, and number 2, the government wouldn't step in and regulate the movie industry for them. So a lot of things were happening in the 1930s. The biggest of them was a scandal. There was an actor named Fatty Arbuckle who threw a huge party at his home, and an up-and-coming actress, Virginia Rapp, was raped and murdered. He was accused for that murder, and the trial was very, very public and very sensational, and he was eventually acquitted, but a lot of movie fans really objected to the movie industry and the morals that a lot of the actors and actresses were portraying in the public. And so the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America was formed, and they basically wanted to make sure that the actors and actresses that they portrayed in their films didn't have a criminal record, that they were upstanding citizens with whatever morals they thought that they should have. And then the miracle case happened where the Supreme Court granted the decision to offer the protection of freedom of speech to films. Up until this point, films were not considered media or speech. They were just considered a money-making business. But obviously, as the popularity of films grew, the industry was able to make the case that they were speech and that they did portray a lot of ideas that were important to the marketplace of ideas. Other issues of freedom of speech in media pertain to the differences between broadcasting and print-based media. So you'll remember back to our conversation on radio and television stations, broadcast television stations, the FCC regulates those because they have since the very beginning of the medium, because there's only a limited number of airwaves for each area. So not everybody can use the airwaves. So the FCC regulates them and grants licenses in each particular geographic area to people who want to own stations. And so because the FCC regulates broadcasting, they are able to have a lot more control over the type of content that is produced there. So in this case, Red Lion Broadcasting versus the FCC, basically the FCC overruled radio broadcasters' right to grant airtime to whoever they wanted, and they said you have a responsibility to the public interest, and so if you're going to offer criticism of a political candidate, then you also have to offer time to that political candidate to come on and basically offer rebuttal to your criticism. The same thing happened, pretty much the same thing happened when the Miami Herald Publishing versus Tornillo. And in this case, the Supreme Court ruled the right to reply law unconstitutional for newspapers, saying that newspapers could print a criticism of a political candidate, but they didn't have to offer that political candidate a right to reply or to defend him or herself. So then you can see the difference in how there's a lot more regulations for broadcasting than there are for print-based media. Other things in broadcasting that are censored, dirty words, indecent speech, those result in hefty fines. So again, we can't punish people based on prior restraint, meaning we can't say, okay, you're going to air this, we've heard that it has indecent content, you can't play it on the air. People can play whatever they want on the air, but if they violate some of these rules, then they'll be fined a monetary fine for doing so. So some of the famous instances of fines would be George Carlin. In 1973, he produced a comedic segment called 7 Dirty Words, and it was aired on the radio in the middle of the day, received some complaints that children were listening, and then that basically established rules that said you're not allowed to air indecent content and between the hours of 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. because children might be listening. In the 90s, Howard Stern is a famous shock jock. He bragged about all of the fines that that the FCC imposed on him for violating indecency standards. The show Family Guy from the 90s and 2000s received a lot of penalties. And then in 2004, a show called Without a Trace that depicted teenagers engaging in a sexual orgy, and the Janet Jackson Super Bowl performance received indecency fines. Other regulations on speech in media would be Section 315, which requires radio and broadcast stations to provide equal opportunities and response time for qualified political candidates during elections. For television broadcasts, this exempts news broadcasts, so things like political debates and news content don't have to provide equal time, which is why when we have debates, the parties can set qualifications. Like if you raise this much money and you have this much airtime, then you can participate, or your poll numbers are this high, then you can participate in the debate. But if you don't meet those standards, you can't participate. So it exempts things like news broadcasts and political debates. But this was a real issue because it basically restricted radio stations from covering anything political because they didn't want to waste airtime making sure that every single candidate who is running for an office has equal airtime, even if they have no shot at winning. And so this Section 315 regulation really dissuaded radio stations from getting into politics because they didn't want to spend hours of their airtime making sure, a third-party candidate with no real shot at winning had the same amount of political airtime as a Republican or a Democrat. So the Fairness Doctrine, which is what we were just discussing, ended in 1987 under the administration of Ronald Reagan, and it basically won because broadcasters argued that it created an unfair burden on them to, like I said, offer points of view from every single candidate. Sometimes support for the Fairness Doctrine will resurface, but it really wasn't a good idea, and so it usually just dies out eventually. Other issues when it comes to regulating speech in media deal with the internet. We have talked about net neutrality quite a bit in this class, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here. But the first initial conversations around freedom of speech in the internet had to do with our First Amendment rights. So like, can you publish obscene things on the internet? Can you harass people on the internet? Can you publish people's information on the internet? Those type of issues, and less around ownership type of issues. But now the battle over net neutrality has really been a big issue recently, and that has to do with whether or not we consider broadband internet to be an essential utility or an information service. So is it something we need in this society like electricity and gas? And if it is, then it needs to be open to everyone and more equal. But if it's considered an information service, then cable companies can take control over the speed of the internet and who gets access to the internet by charging more money for higher speeds and so on and so forth. The last thing I want to talk about in this lecture is just to think about the First Amendment and democracy. So what issues of freedom of speech really pertain to the media, and what kind of questions should we be asking about this? And the book tells us as citizens we must engage in public debate about media ownership. So one of those issues would be net neutrality. Pay attention to those excluded from opportunities not only to buy products but to shape the cultural landscape. Challenge journalists and leaders, and become watchdogs and critical consumers. The last one is particularly important in this information environment because we do have so much information out there. We have to be critical consumers, and when we see something that is unethical or is untrue, then we have to be watchdogs and we have to stand up and make sure that we say something about it.